working so hard to attain these things for ourselves when, as a servant of the Supreme, we would get them automatically. A servant of God gets to live in God's kingdom. He gets to be supported by God and taken care of by God. And we've practically experienced this in our spiritual community, where the deities are the center, and we are all their servants. Yet we each have much better accommodations and facilities than we ever would individually by ourselves. So therefore, the real goal of spiritual life is not to become one with God, and not to become God. That's impossible. If you were God, you'd be God already. God is always God, and we are always His parts and parcels, individual, spiritual living entities, conscious, eternal. So eternal life is already there. The question is, what are we doing with our eternal life? If we're here in the material world trying to find our perfect body among the three modes of material nature, then we're always going to experience suffering and different kinds of frustration, embarrassment, and failure. So why are we wasting our time trying to pursue something that doesn't really exist? This is called illusion. Another word for it is ignorance. Because we do not know the actual spiritual path, we accept something which is not the real spiritual path. Because we do not know the actual method of finding or regaining our perfect body, we accept some false method of trying to pursue our aims. And therefore we're frustrated. But that doesn't have to be. We can accept the knowledge of the esoteric teaching, which is pure spiritual knowledge coming down from incredible antiquity. And we can understand our actual spiritual nature. We are eternal, individuals, and we have a spiritual perfect body, which is also eternal and unique. But because we have become covered by a material false ego, mind, intelligence, and a material body with senses that link us to the material world, we tend to think that we are material beings. Nothing could be further from the truth. The fact that we are conscious means automatically we are spiritual and eternal, individuals forever. Nothing can take these qualities away from us because they are our very nature. So, when we try to attain a perfect body in this material world, we're cheating ourselves because we aren't material beings. We're spiritual beings. And even if we find a perfect situation in this material world, it's not really going to make us happy because it's temporary. It'll be taken away from us by time. So our real nature is spiritual, and our real perfect body is spiritual. It's in the spiritual world. It's not in this material world. Why are we looking for it here? The real path to spiritual enlightenment and happiness is to change our consciousness from material to spiritual. And how do we do that? It's not by keeping this myth of merging into God, because that's not really possible. It might happen to a few living entities who happen to come across God's path and anger Him and get killed by Him. But it doesn't happen to the majority of living entities. It just can't. Most of us are meant to be God's servants in the spiritual world. And to be a servant in the material world is a degrading kind of proposition. But to be God's servant is an elevating kind of proposition, because everything in connection with God is wonderful. So we experience that every day here in our eco-commune in the Deep South. And we know it to be true by experience. But how can you know it? Well, imagine that you have a perfect friend. A friend who is always there for you, who always cares for you. A friend who has no imperfections, no lack of anything. A friend who loves you unconditionally and will always stand by you no matter what happens. Imagine you had a friend like that. Now, wouldn't you be delighted to be with that friend no matter what it required or how you had to change your life in order to harmonize your existence with his? So that's the way it is with God. God is actually our dearmost friend. Now, why would we want to spoil this friendship by annihilating our individuality? If we're no longer an individual, how can we have friendships? We won't even be conscious. Therefore, real spiritual life means to cultivate this friendship, this eternal loving relationship with God. This is the real meaning of yoga. Yogo yukta prasanatma na sochati na kankshati. One who is actually linked with God in yoga has no worries and no suffering. He doesn't desire or lament to have anything. He simply enjoys this beautiful relationship with his dearmost friend, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Now that's real yoga. And that's not attainable by sitting and standing on your head and putting your ankles behind your neck and stuff like that. That's not yoga. That's just some stretching exercises so that you can sit properly for meditation. That's all that is. So once you can sit, then what do you do? Well, we advise, and the esoteric teaching advises, that you chant the holy name of God. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya, or any Vishnu mantra. They're all just as good. And they all bring you to not oneness with God, but friendship with God. That state where we know who we are in eternity, and we have a loving, beautiful relationship with God in the spiritual world. So we're inviting you to attain that kind of consciousness, to give up this material consciousness, which is simply full of suffering and different kinds of embarrassment and frustration, and to take up ecstatic spiritual consciousness in relationship with God. That's the real meaning of the esoteric teaching, and that's the ontology that we are trying to give you. If you take up this ontology, then your consciousness will change. Just like we said, in consciousness there are three elements: the conscious individual subject, the object of which one is conscious, and the relationship between them. It's the relationship that gives meaning to the experience, and that relationship is our ontology. It's the meaning that we give to everything. It's the attitudes and the expectations that we carry into every situation. Our ontology determines how we interpret things. So when we have an experience, our ontology gives us a set of relationships that we can use to interpret that experience. In material life, our ontology is inadequate to explain our spiritual experiences. Everybody has spiritual experiences. Actually, we have them all the time, but we don't recognize them because our ontology is inadequate to explain them. Therefore, the esoteric teaching is an ontology, or a set of stories and expectations that explain the realm of spiritual consciousness, so that when we have a spiritual experience, we can understand it, put it into perspective, and we can ultimately attain our real, eternal, perfect body. We hope you've enjoyed this edition of My Perfect Body. This is David Hughes, your host, reminding you to visit us on the web at esotericteaching.org, where you can purchase the complete Esoteric Teaching Introductory Seminar DVD and many CDs of transcendental music and mantras.